The Grand Assembly Hall of Concordance Station had been designed to facilitate the kind of negotiations that shaped civilizations, and it accomplished this by being the most aggressively neutral room in the known galaxy. The walls were a shade of gray that had been selected through an exhaustive interspecies study to provoke the minimum possible emotional response from every known sentient species, which meant it provoked a mild, universal depression that the designers had classified as diplomatic focus enhancement, and that everyone who worked in the room recognized as the architectural equivalent of being inside a headache. The lighting was calibrated to offend no species' visual receptors, achieving this by satisfying none of them. The furniture was modular, adjustable, and designed with the ergonomic philosophy that if a chair was equally uncomfortable for everyone, equality had been achieved. Marcus Webb had been sitting in one of these chairs for 18 hours. He had been sitting in similar chairs for 3 weeks. He had, at this point, developed a relationship with the furniture that was more intimate than several of his human friendships, in the sense that the chair knew the exact contours of his lower back, and he knew the exact location of the structural flaw in the armrest that dug into his elbow if he leaned left. And they had reached an understanding about these things the way long-term adversaries reach understandings, through attrition and mutual resignation. He was 36. He looked at this moment approximately 50, because 18 hours of continuous treaty negotiation did to a human face what 3 weeks of rain did to an unpaved road. It eroded the features into something that retained the general shape of the original, but had lost all pretense of maintenance. His dark hair, which had begun the session in a state of professional tidiness, had been pushed back by his hands so many times that it had achieved a permanent backward lean, like grass blown by a wind that had stopped but whose effects remained. His brown eyes were open through a combination of stimulant supplements, stale coffee, and the stubborn refusal of his nervous system to shut down while contractual language remained unfinalized. His shirt was wrinkled. His tie had been loosened 4 hours ago and removed entirely 2 hours after that, folded into his jacket pocket with the ceremonial solemnity of a man admitting defeat against an article of clothing. Across the negotiating table, the Vethani delegation maintained the composed, rested appearance that their species biology provided as standard equipment. Vethani did not display fatigue the way humans did. Their metabolic systems processed extended wakefulness through a secondary energy pathway that human scientists had described, with obvious envy, as profoundly unfair. And the result was that, after 18 hours of negotiations, the Vethani delegation looked exactly as they had at hour one: precise, elegant, and operating at full capacity, while their human counterparts slowly dissolved into caffeine-sustained approximations of functional adults. Ambassador Sailara Venkasari sat at the center of the Vethani delegation, with the composed authority of someone who had been born into diplomacy, and had spent a career mastering it to a degree that made other diplomats feel like enthusiastic amateurs. She was tall, even-seated, with the elongated proportions that characterized Vethani physiology, a species whose bone structure carried an elegance that human aesthetics struggled not to find beautiful. Her features held the architecture of human femininity rearranged by a different evolutionary hand: higher cheekbones, sharper at the apex, a jaw that tapered with geometric precision, eyes that were larger and set slightly wider than human standard, their irises a luminous violet silver that caught the assembly hall's neutral lighting and improved it considerably. Her skin was the feature that commanded attention. Vethani chromatic epidermis shifted color in response to emotional and cognitive states, a biological communication system that functioned as both language and involuntary display. And Sailara's skin moved through its palette with the controlled subtlety of someone who had spent decades learning to manage what could not be fully suppressed. During the negotiations, her coloring had maintained a steady diplomatic silver blue, the Vethani equivalent of professional composure, a neutral tone that communicated engagement without revealing position. Occasionally, during particularly complex clause discussions, threads of deeper blue would surface, indicating analytical intensity, and Marcus had learned over 3 weeks to read these shifts as signals that she was processing the implications of a proposal rather than responding to it, which gave him a negotiating advantage he had not shared with his team, because some advantages were more valuable when kept private. Her hair was pale silver, long, arranged in a style that Marcus's cultural briefing described as indicative of senior diplomatic rank, and that his personal assessment described as striking in a way that he had filed under observations. He was not going to act on because he was a professional, and she was a foreign ambassador, and the treaty was more important than the fact that 3 weeks of watching her mind work had produced an admiration. He was managing through the time-honored diplomatic technique of not thinking about it. The treaty was one clause from completion, 17 shipping corridors, the first permanent trade relationship between humanity and the Vethani sovereignty. 3 weeks of meticulous work, every word weighed, every provision calibrated, arriving at the final session where the last remaining clause, a tariff exemption provision for biological research materials, required Ambassador Celara's confirmation of language before both parties could sign. Marcus looked at his datapad. The clause was straightforward. The confirmation was routine. His mouth opened to form the words that his diplomatic training had made reflexive. Ambassador Venkasari, could you confirm the language of Provision 47, subsection C? What his mouth actually produced, courtesy of a brain that had been running on emergency reserves for 4 hours and that had confused the neural pathway for formal diplomatic address with the neural pathway for asking his wife to pass the salt during dinner, was, "Sweetheart, could you confirm the language of Provision 47, subsection C?" The silence was immediate, total, and carried the specific atmospheric density of 60 people simultaneously experiencing the same catastrophic realization. It was not the silence of a pause or a gap in conversation. It was the silence of an event, a moment so far outside the expected parameters of diplomatic proceedings that the room's collective cognitive processing power redirected itself entirely toward understanding what had just happened, leaving no residual capacity for sound production. Marcus's translator had broadcast the word in Vethani. His model was a high-end diplomatic unit, calibrated for precision, designed to render human speech in Vethani with the cultural accuracy that treaty negotiations required. It did not editorialize. It did not soften. It translated sweetheart into the precise Vethani equivalent, which was a word, velkithais, that Marcus's cultural briefing had covered in Section 12 of the Social Protocols Appendix, a section he had reviewed during the first week, and had since buried beneath 3 weeks of tariff schedules and trade corridor specifications. Velkithais was not a casual endearment. In Vethani linguistic architecture, terms of romantic declaration were neurologically gated. Producing the specific phonemic combination required conscious, deliberate intent, a biological safeguard hardwired into Vethani speech processing that prevented accidental romantic utterances, the way the human gag reflex prevented accidental swallowing of harmful objects. A Vethani could not say velkithais by mistake. The word could only emerge from a Vethani mouth through purposeful cognitive activation, which meant that in Vethani cultural understanding, hearing the word spoken was proof of intent in the same way that seeing a signature on a document was proof of agreement. There was no accidental velkithais. The concept did not exist. When spoken publicly, in the presence of more than 10 witnesses, velkithais constituted a formal marriage proposal under Vethani cultural law. It was binding, witnessed, and recorded. The speaker had declared romantic claim. The recipient was required to formally accept or formally refuse. There was no third option. Marcus had just proposed to Ambassador Celara Venkasari in front of 60 witnesses, both delegations, and a diplomatic recording system that had captured the word, the silence, and the chromatic explosion that followed with the merciless fidelity of technology that did not understand embarrassment. Celara's skin detonated. There was no other word for it. The controlled silver blue of 3 weeks of diplomatic composure shattered into a cascade of colors that moved across her visible skin, with the rapid, uncontrolled urgency of a system overwhelmed by input it could not process through normal channels. Deep violet, shock; bright copper, confusion; a flash of crimson that her delegation recognized as acute social alarm. And beneath it all, moving through the chaos like a current through turbulent water, a brief but unmistakable pulse of warm gold that appeared across her cheekbones and vanished in less than a second, but that was, to every Vethani in the room who saw it, as legible as a printed statement. Genuine emotional warmth in response to romantic attention. She saw it, they saw it. And the fact that her body had betrayed a response she had not authorized in the most public setting possible added a layer of personal humiliation to an already catastrophic diplomatic situation that would have been impressive in its complexity if anyone in the room had been capable of appreciating complexity at that moment, which they were not, because they were all too busy being paralyzed. Marcus's brain, operating on the delayed processing schedule of severe sleep deprivation, caught up with his mouth approximately 4 seconds after the word left it. The sequence of his internal experience mirrored the 5 stages of grief, but compressed into a time frame that would have interested neurological researchers. Denial, I did not just say that. Anger at himself, immediate and comprehensive. Bargaining, perhaps the translator malfunctioned. Depression, it did not malfunction. And acceptance, I have ended my career, collapsed a trade treaty, and possibly started an interstellar incident because my brain thought I was talking to my wife. He began, and every human in his delegation simultaneously tensed, because they could see the apology forming and they knew, even if Marcus did not yet know, that apologizing was going to make it worse. I am so sorry, Ambassador. That was completely, I was exhausted, I wasn't, it was an accident, a linguistic, I would never intentionally. Dr. Priya Anand, the cultural liaison seated 3 chairs to Marcus's left, closed her eyes with the expression of someone watching a building collapse in slow motion from inside the building. The apology did make it worse, because Marcus was now publicly stating that his marriage proposal, which the Vethani had processed as deliberate and intentional, was accidental, which the Vethani had no framework to understand. In their neurolinguistic reality, Velkethis could not be accidental. Claiming it was accidental was either a lie, which was a diplomatic offense, or an indication that human neurology lacked the safeguards that Vethani considered fundamental to civilized communication, which was a different kind of alarming. Either way, the apology did not resolve the proposal. It complicated it. Celara had not spoken. Her chromatic display had not stabilized. She sat at the center of the Vethani delegation, with her violet-silver eyes fixed on Marcus, and her skin cycling through colors at a rate that her colleagues had never seen from her. Because Ambassador Celara Venkasari had spent 30 years in diplomatic service and had never once lost chromatic composure, and the fact that she was losing it now, in this room, in front of these witnesses, over a word spoken by an exhausted human who smelled like stale coffee and looked like he had not slept since the previous calendar day, was a development that her delegation was processing with the collective cognitive speed of people watching something unprecedented happen to someone they thought was unshakable. She stood. The motion was controlled, her diplomatic training asserting itself through the chromatic chaos with the mechanical discipline of a system that operated on autopilot when the primary controls were overwhelmed. She spoke one sentence in formal Vethani that Marcus's translator rendered as, "The delegation requests a recess for consultation." Then she turned and walked toward the private chamber reserved for the Vethani delegation, and her skin, visible above the collar of her diplomatic robes and along her hands and the exposed line of her neck, was still shifting. Violet, copper, silver, and the ghost of that warm gold moving beneath the surface like something she was trying to push down, and that refused to stay. The door closed behind her. The assembly hall remained in silence for approximately 7 additional seconds before both delegations erupted into the specific, urgent murmuring of people who had just witnessed a disaster and were competing to be the first to accurately assess its magnitude. Dr. Priya Anand found Marcus in the corridor outside the assembly hall, sitting on the floor with his back against the aggressively neutral wall and his head in his hands, in the posture of a man who had been successfully vertical for 18 hours and had chosen this particular moment to surrender to gravity's long-standing invitation. "Tell me exactly how bad this is," he said without lifting his head. Priya sat down beside him, because the floor was apparently where this conversation was happening, and because she had spent enough time in diplomatic crises to understand that the location of a conversation mattered less than its content. She was 42, a xenocultural specialist who had spent 15 years studying Vethani social structures, and who had been assigned to this negotiation, specifically because the Trade Commission recognized that putting humans and Vethani in close proximity for 3 weeks created opportunities for cultural missteps. Though the specific misstep of proposing to the opposing ambassador during the final treaty session had not appeared in any of her scenario planning documents. Under Vethani law, she said, a public declaration of Velkethis witnessed by more than 10 individuals constitutes a formal marriage proposal. Formal proposals require formal response, either acceptance or refusal. There is no mechanism for retraction, withdrawal, or reclassification as accidental, because they can't say it accidentally. Correct, their neurolinguistic architecture prevents it. The phonemic combination requires conscious activation of specific cognitive pathways. To a Vethani, hearing Velkethis is the same as seeing a signed contract. It is proof of intent. Claiming it was accidental is like claiming you accidentally signed your name on a legal document. I was exhausted. I call my wife sweetheart. My brain just, I understand what happened. The Vethani do not. And here is where it gets complicated. Priya paused with the deliberate care of someone about to deliver information that would make a bad situation worse and who wanted the delivery to be precise. If Selara formally refuses the proposal, Vethani cultural law interprets public refusal of a diplomatic counterpart's declaration as rejection of the diplomatic relationship. Not just the proposal, the entire relationship. The trade treaty, the shipping corridors, 3 weeks of work, and the foundation of human Vethani commerce would be interpreted as rejected alongside the proposal. Marcus lifted his head, so she can't refuse. Not without collapsing everything we've built. And she can't accept because I didn't mean to ask. Correct. Acceptance would bind her to a marriage with someone who has publicly stated the proposal was unintentional, which in Vethani culture is a humiliation so profound that it would effectively end her diplomatic career. So she can't accept and she can't refuse. Welcome to the crisis. Marcus stared at the opposite wall. The gray was exactly as neutral and exactly as depressing as the gray inside the assembly hall, which suggested that the station's designers had achieved consistency, if nothing else. There's something else, Priya said, her chromatic response. I saw it, a lot of colors. One specific color, a pulse of warm gold across her cheekbones. It appeared for less than a second, but it was visible to every Vethani in the room. What does warm gold mean? Priya looked at him with the expression of a cultural specialist who was about to make a diplomatic crisis considerably more personal. Genuine emotional warmth in response to romantic attention. It's involuntary. She cannot fake it and she cannot suppress it. Her body responded to your declaration before her mind could intervene, and what it displayed was not entirely negative. Marcus was quiet for a long time. She was not unaffected, Priya said carefully, and her delegation knows it. And the fact that her involuntary chromatic display revealed a response she did not authorize in the most public setting possible is, in Vethani culture, deeply humiliating. She's not just dealing with your proposal. She's dealing with the fact that her own body told the room something she did not consent to share. The Vethani private. He entered a room that was smaller than the assembly hall, but that carried a different kind of weight. The private weight of a space where someone had been sitting alone with a crisis for 4 hours, and where the air felt heavier with the residue of processing. Selara stood near the viewport, her back to the door, and the chromatic display on the visible skin of her neck and hands had settled into a deep, slow-moving pattern of muted violet and silver that Marcus recognized. After 3 weeks of learning to read her, as exhaustion, not physical but emotional, the Vethani equivalent of a human who had been crying and had stopped, and was now in the quiet aftermath where everything felt raw. She turned when he entered. Her violet-silver eyes found him with an expression that contained layers he could identify and layers he could not, the diplomatic composure reassembled but thinner now, the emotional architecture visible beneath it the way a building's framework becomes visible when the facade is damaged. The warm gold was gone. The shock was gone. What remained was something quieter and more complex. "I called you sweetheart," Marcus said, because beginning with the truth seemed like the only approach that had any chance of working, and because he was too tired for strategy. "I have been awake for 18 hours. I was running on stimulants and muscle memory. In that moment, my brain failed to distinguish between you and my wife, which is both the explanation and the most professionally humiliating sentence I have ever spoken." Selara's skin shifted, a brief ripple of copper that was surprise, not at the content but at the delivery. Vethani diplomats did not begin conversations with unfiltered admissions of cognitive failure. Human diplomats apparently did. "Your cultural liaison explained your neuro-linguistic architecture," he continued. "I understand that your species cannot produce Velkethis accidentally. I understand that what your people heard was a deliberate declaration. And I understand that my explanation, that it was a mistake, sounds to you the way it would sound to me if someone told me they accidentally signed a contract. Impossible, incomprehensible." "It is incomprehensible," Selara said. Her voice was controlled, but the harmonic subtones that Vethani's speech carried, the secondary frequencies that conveyed emotional truth, were less steady than her words. "My neurology cannot produce that word without intent. The concept of accidental declaration exists in my understanding only as a theoretical impossibility that xenolinguists discuss in academic settings. And yet—" She paused. Her skin shifted again, a slow wave of deep blue that indicated processing at depths that conscious thought could not fully direct. "And yet I watched your face when you said it. And I saw a man who did not know what he had done until after he had done it. And I have spent 30 years reading faces across negotiating tables, and what I saw was not performance. It wasn't. Which means your species can produce through fatigue and accident a declaration that mine can only produce through deliberate intent. And the implications of that difference are," she stopped, resumed, "significant." Marcus took a breath. "I need to tell you something else. And I need to tell you honestly because the alternative is letting the diplomatic machinery process this into something that helps nobody." Selara's violet-silver eyes held his. Her chromatic display stilled the Vethani equivalent of holding one's breath. "Calling you sweetheart was an accident. I was exhausted. I confused you with my wife. That's the truth. But saying that the word carried zero resonance would be a different kind of dishonesty, and I think you've had enough dishonesty for one day." He met her gaze with the direct, unperforming attention of a man who had run out of diplomatic energy and had only personal energy left. "I have spent 3 weeks watching you negotiate, watching your mind work. I have never worked with anyone whose intelligence I respected more, And somewhere in the last 3 weeks that respect developed a quality that I was managing by not thinking about it, which worked fine until my brain decided to stop filtering. Celara's skin bloomed, warm gold, rising from beneath the muted violet like sunrise through clouds, spreading across her cheekbones and down her neck in a pattern that was involuntary and undeniable, and that she watched happen on her own hands with the expression of someone whose body was confirming something her mind had been arguing against. "You are making this more complicated," she said. "I know. Significantly more complicated. I know that too." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the assembly hall. That silence had been shock. This silence was two people standing in the space between what had happened and what might happen, aware that the space was precarious and that moving in any direction would have consequences. "There is a provision," Celara said. "In Vethani declaration law. It is rarely invoked. It is called the suspended declaration, Velkithais en Sarai. It allows a public proposal to be neither accepted nor refused but held in formal abeyance. The words are acknowledged as spoken and witnessed. Their resolution is deferred, indefinitely." What does that mean practically? It means the declaration exists, formally, publicly on record, but it requires no immediate answer. It creates a space where the question remains open, where the words have weight but not yet consequence. A diplomatic limbo. "A possibility," she corrected, and the warm gold on her skin pulsed once slowly, in a rhythm that the Vethani chromatic lexicon associated with conscious acceptance of an emotional truth. Marcus looked at the ambassador whose mind he had spent 3 weeks admiring and whose skin was telling him, in a language she could not suppress, that the admiration was not entirely one-directional. "The treaty," he said, "will be completed. The suspended declaration preserves the diplomatic relationship by acknowledging the declaration without forcing resolution. Both delegations can proceed. And us." The word "us" landed in the room like a second Velkithais, smaller and quieter, but carrying its own weight. Celara's chromatic display shifted through a sequence that was complex and beautiful, and that Marcus could read just well enough to know that it contained conflict and warmth, and the specific Vethani color for something that translated approximately as, "This is not what I expected, and I do not know what to do with it, and I am not entirely certain I want it to stop." "The suspended declaration creates space," she said. "What occupies that space is for the people involved to determine, without witnesses, without diplomatic record, without a flicker of something that might have been humor moved through her expression, without translators making declarations that their operators did not authorize." "I'm going to sleep for approximately 14 hours, Marcus said. "And when I wake up, I'm going to send you a message asking if you'd like to have dinner. Not as a diplomatic function, not as treaty obligation, as two people who apparently have things to discuss that are not covered by any negotiating framework either of our civilizations has developed." "Dinner," Celara said. "Dinner, no translators, no delegation, no recording systems. You realize that in Vethani culture, a private meal between a declarant and a recipient during a suspended declaration period is considered." "A date, I know." Priya briefed me. The warm gold on Celara's skin steadied. It did not pulse or flicker or shift. It held, warm and even, across her cheekbones and along the elegant line of her jaw, and the violet silver of her eyes carried the faintest luminous quality that Marcus had seen only once before, in the assembly hall, in the fraction of a second before her composure broke, in the moment when her body answered his accidental question with an involuntary truth. "Then I will consider your invitation," she said, "when it arrives." The treaty was completed the following day. Both delegations signed in the assembly hall under the aggressively neutral lighting, and the 17 shipping corridors opened, and the foundation of human Vethani commerce was established on terms that both civilizations considered fair. And the diplomatic record noted, in a footnote that would be studied by xenocultural scholars for decades, that the proceedings included a suspended declaration between the lead negotiators whose resolution was pending. Marcus slept for 14 hours. He woke, showered, put on a clean shirt, and sent a message to Ambassador Salara Venkasari that contained no diplomatic language, no formal address, and no terms that any translator could misinterpret. It said, "Dinner, just us." Her response arrived 11 minutes later. It was one word in Vethani that his translator rendered with a confidence it had not displayed since before the incident, and the word was yes. And it was, according to Priya's subsequent analysis, produced through the neurologically gated pathway that required conscious, deliberate intent, which meant that this